At exactly 2:15 p.m. on September 27, 2025, Attorney General Pam Bondi stood before the Justice Department's briefing podium, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority as she delivered what would become the most consequential warning of her tenure. 3 days had passed since Joshua Jahn's sniper attack on the Dallas ICE facility had claimed one life and shattered any illusion that America's immigration agents were safe from domestic terrorism. The blood was still fresh on the concrete when Bondi declared war on what she called a new era of political violence. "We are taking our country back," Bondi announced, her words echoing through the marble halls of justice like a battle cry. "Anyone who threatens or assaults our federal officers will be arrested and charged federally, not in some liberal state court." The warning wasn't theoretical. It was a direct response to an escalating pattern of violence that had transformed America's immigration enforcement into a battlefield where federal agents faced not just resistance, but assassination attempts. The crisis had reached a breaking point on September 24th, when 9-year-old Joshua Jahn positioned himself on a Dallas rooftop with an 8mm bolt-action rifle, waiting for ICE agents to begin their morning transport operations. At 6:30 a.m., as 3 detainees were being processed in the facility's sally port, Jahn began firing indiscriminately. The bullets that tore through the morning air carried more than lead, they carried a message. Shell casings found at the scene bore the handwritten words, "Anti-ICE," transforming ammunition into political manifestos. 1 detainee died instantly. 2 others were rushed to nearby hospitals in critical condition. Jahn's shots had missed their intended targets, the ICE agents themselves, but the message was unmistakable. Federal investigators would later discover handwritten notes in Jahn's residence revealing months of planning and a chilling declaration. Hopefully, this will give ICE agents real terror. To think, is there a sniper with AP rounds on that roof? The shooting wasn't an isolated incident, but the violent culmination of what Bondi characterized as coordinated attacks by radical extremists. Evidence found on Jahn's devices revealed he had researched ICE tracking apps, downloaded Department of Homeland Security facility information, and studied the recent assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk in Utah. Most disturbing, FBI Director Kash Patel revealed that Jahn had researched how to track ICE agents' locations, suggesting a level of premeditation that transformed this from a spontaneous act of violence into calculated domestic terrorism. But Jahn's attack was merely the spark that ignited a larger conflagration. As Bondi spoke that September afternoon, Democratic leaders across the country were actively encouraging resistance to federal immigration enforcement, creating what Justice Department officials viewed as a clear and present danger to federal agents' lives. Representative Nancy Pelosi had fired the first shot in this political war just days before Jahn's attack, declaring that state and local authorities may arrest federal agents if they break California law. Her statement wasn't just rhetoric, it was a blueprint for insurrection that Bondi's Justice Department viewed as a direct threat to federal supremacy. "You cannot disclose the identity of a federal agent, where they live, or anything that can harm them," Bondi warned, her voice cutting through the political noise with surgical precision. The warning came with immediate consequences. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche had already dispatched preservation letters to Pelosi and San Francisco District Attorney Brooke Jenkins, demanding they preserve all communications related to their anti-ICE activities. The message was clear: interfere with federal agents and face federal charges. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker had joined the resistance movement, accusing ICE of racial profiling and calling for accountability measures that Justice Department officials viewed as obstruction. "Careful, at Gov Pritzker, this applies to you too," Blanche tweeted, delivering a digital warning shot that reverberated through Democratic circles. Acting U.S. Attorney Bill Asaley was even more direct. "If you touch our agents, you'll be arrested." The most egregious example of Democratic resistance came from Chicago, where former Mayor Lori Lightfoot announced plans to create what Bondi called an ICE tracker, a digital platform designed to monitor and expose federal agents' locations and activities. The proposal represented everything that was wrong with the progressive response to immigration enforcement, treating federal law enforcement officers like enemy combatants rather than public servants carrying out congressional mandates. "She will be getting a letter from us tomorrow to preserve anything she's done," Bondi declared, "to make sure she's not violating the law." The warning carried the full weight of federal prosecution. Lightfoot's tracking scheme wasn't just political theater, it was potentially criminal activity that could expose federal agents to the same kind of targeted violence that had claimed lives in Dallas. FBI Director Patel had been equally blunt in his assessment of the tracking applications. "No one is allowed to touch a federal cop on my watch," he declared. If they participate in an ICE tracking scheme via an app, they will find themselves in handcuffs. The technology that had enabled Jahn's attack was being weaponized by democratic activists who claimed to support peaceful resistance while providing tools for violence. The pattern was undeniable and terrifying. Democrats were creating a hostile environment where federal agents were viewed as legitimate targets for harassment, exposure, and violence. Representative Robert Garcia and Senator Richard Blumenthal had announced plans to launch a master ICE tracker that would collect and disseminate information about federal operations, essentially creating a database for targeting federal personnel. Bondi's response was swift and comprehensive. She ordered Department of Justice agents deployed to ICE facilities nationwide, creating what she called an ICE Protection Task Force that combined federal, state, and local resources to defend immigration enforcement operations. The FBI, DEA, U.S. Marshals Service, and Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives were all mobilized to protect ICE personnel and facilities. I am also instructing the Joint Terrorism Task Forces across the country to disrupt and investigate all entities and individuals engaged in acts of domestic terrorism, including the repeated acts of violence and obstruction against federal agents, Bondi announced. The language was deliberate. She was treating anti-ICE resistance as terrorism, subject to the full arsenal of federal counter-terrorism tools. The escalation wasn't limited to words. Bondi's Justice Department had successfully pressured Facebook to remove pages used to dox and target ICE agents in Chicago, demonstrating the administration's willingness to use both legal and technological pressure to protect federal personnel. The wave of violence against ICE has been driven by online apps and social media campaigns designed to put ICE officers at risk just for doing their jobs, Bondi explained. The international implications were equally significant. Foreign intelligence services and diplomatic missions were closely monitoring the breakdown of federal authority in sanctuary cities, with some governments questioning whether the United States could maintain the rule of law within its own borders. When local officials openly defied federal immigration enforcement, it sent a signal to the world that America's legal system was negotiable. The human cost was mounting daily. Beyond the Dallas shooting, ICE reported that assaults against its officers had risen eightfold since Trump began mass deportations. Agents faced not just physical attacks, but psychological warfare designed to make them fear for their families' safety. The leaking of raid locations and agent identities had become standard practice among resistance groups, turning every immigration operation into a potential ambush. Bondi's warnings extended beyond individual threats to encompass the broader breakdown of federal authority. When governors and mayors openly defied federal immigration law, they weren't just engaging in political theater, they were undermining the constitutional principle of federal supremacy that held the nation together. We've seen this before, Bondi noted, referencing the Portland riots and Los Angeles violence that had characterized previous resistance movements. These are not peaceful protests. These are coordinated attacks by radical extremists, and they end now. The reference wasn't accidental. Bondi was drawing a direct line between previous anti-law enforcement violence and the current anti-ICE campaign. The stakes couldn't be higher. Federal agents were being hunted by domestic terrorists, emboldened by democratic rhetoric, and enabled by tracking technology. The very officials sworn to uphold the law were being treated as enemies of the state by elected leaders who had forgotten that immigration enforcement was a federal responsibility, not a local option. As Bondi concluded her historic warning, the message was unmistakable. The federal government would no longer tolerate a situation where its agents faced assassination attempts while carrying out congressional mandates. The era of sanctuary city resistance had evolved into something far more dangerous: domestic terrorism with a political mask. "Make America safe again," Bondi declared, her words carrying the promise of federal action and the threat of federal prosecution. The warning had been delivered. Now the question was whether Democratic leaders would heed it or whether they would continue down a path that led inevitably to federal charges and constitutional crisis. The answer would determine not just the fate of immigration enforcement, but the survival of federal authority itself in an era when political resistance had transformed into domestic terrorism. Behind the scenes, federal investigators were uncovering an even more disturbing picture of coordinated resistance. Intelligence reports obtained by the Justice Department revealed that anti-ICE groups had developed sophisticated networks spanning multiple states, sharing tactical information about federal operations and agent movements. These weren't spontaneous protests, but carefully orchestrated campaigns designed to neutralize federal immigration enforcement through intimidation and violence. The scope of the threat became clear when FBI analysts discovered that Jahn had been in contact with several online forums dedicated to ICE resistance before his attack. Chat logs recovered from his devices showed discussions about targeting federal facilities, with participants sharing maps of ICE offices, agent schedules, and tactical advice for conducting surveillance. The Dallas shooting wasn't the work of a lone wolf, it was the product of a radicalization network that federal authorities were only beginning to understand. Most alarmingly, the investigation revealed that several Democratic-controlled jurisdictions had been systematically undermining federal operations through intelligence sharing with resistance groups. Internal communications obtained through federal subpoenas showed city officials providing advance warning of ICE operations to activist networks, effectively turning local government into an intelligence service for anti-federal forces. California had emerged as the epicenter of this resistance movement. Governor Gavin Newsom's administration had created what federal prosecutors privately called a shadow intelligence apparatus designed to monitor and disrupt federal immigration operations. State employees were being used to track federal agents, document their activities, and share that information with activist groups, who then used it to organize protests and harassment campaigns. The pattern was so systematic that federal investigators suspected coordination at the highest levels of Democratic leadership. Phone records obtained through national security warrants showed regular communications between resistance organizers in different states, suggesting a level of planning that went far beyond local activism. The human cost of this campaign was becoming impossible to ignore. ICE agent Maria Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran of federal law enforcement, had been forced to relocate her family after activists published her home address online following a raid in Los Angeles. Agent David Chen received death threats so credible that federal marshals had to provide protective details for his children's school. Agent Sarah Williams discovered protesters outside her church, carrying signs with her photograph and the message "ICE Killer." These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a systematic campaign to make federal service impossible. The message was clear: work for ICE and your family becomes a target. The psychological warfare was proving as effective as physical violence in driving agents away from federal service. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem had revealed the broader implications of the crisis during a Fox News interview. "We're going to hire more ICE officers. We're going to go out and hire more law enforcement officers. We're not going to stand for this in the United States," she declared. But recruitment was becoming increasingly difficult when federal service meant putting your family at risk of domestic terrorism. The technological dimension of the threat was equally concerning. Federal investigators had identified dozens of smartphone applications designed specifically to track ICE operations, with names like ICE Watch, Raid Alert, and Agent Tracker. These apps crowdsourced intelligence gathering, allowing thousands of users to report federal activities in real time. The data was then aggregated and distributed to resistance networks, creating an early warning system that allowed targets to escape before arrests could be made. More sophisticated was the emergence of facial recognition technology being used to identify federal agents. Activists were photographing ICE personnel during operations, then using artificial intelligence to match those images against social media profiles and public records. The result was detailed dossiers on federal agents that included home addresses, family members, and personal information that could be used for targeting. The legal implications were staggering. Federal prosecutors were preparing cases under the domestic terrorism statutes, arguing that the systematic targeting of federal agents constituted a campaign of political violence designed to influence government policy through intimidation. The charges would carry sentences of up to life in prison, reflecting the severity with which the Justice Department viewed the threat. International observers were closely monitoring the crisis as a test of American federal authority. Foreign intelligence services had begun documenting the breakdown of immigration enforcement in certain jurisdictions, with some governments questioning whether the United States could effectively control its own borders when local officials actively sabotaged federal operations. The economic implications were equally significant. Businesses in sanctuary jurisdictions were beginning to factor the breakdown of immigration enforcement into their location decisions, with some companies relocating operations to states where federal law was respected. The message was clear: lawlessness had consequences that extended far beyond immigration policy. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that some resistance groups had begun exploring more sophisticated forms of violence. Intelligence reports indicated discussions of targeting federal detention facilities, disrupting deportation flights, and even attacking immigration courts. The escalation from protests to assassinations suggested a movement that was losing any connection to legal resistance. The international implications extended beyond mere observation. Several foreign governments had begun quietly expressing concerns about the safety of their diplomats and citizens in jurisdictions where federal authority was being challenged. The breakdown of immigration enforcement was being interpreted as a broader breakdown of American governmental capacity. Federal agents were reporting unprecedented levels of stress and early retirement requests. The combination of physical danger, family threats, and official hostility from local governments was creating a crisis in federal law enforcement recruitment and retention that threatened the government's ability to enforce immigration law effectively. As Bondi's warnings echoed through Democratic strongholds across the nation, the fundamental question remained: would American democracy survive a situation where one political party viewed federal law enforcement as an enemy to be defeated rather than an institution to be respected? The answer would determine whether the United States remained a nation of laws or devolved into a collection of competing jurisdictions where federal authority meant nothing.